Hello and welcome to the George Washington University and to another edition of the Kalb Report, a monthly public policy program funded by the Knight Foundation and co-sponsored by the National Press Club, the George Washington University, and the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard. I'm Marvin Kalb, Executive Director of the Washington office of the Shorenstein Center. During this academic year, we have been focusing in this series on the impact of economic pressures on the newsroom. Our guest today knows a good bit about the subject. He is Ted Koppel, who has been anchoring Nightline for ABC News for the past 22 years. He's been with ABC for almost 40 years. Recently, his corporate boss, Disney, tried to hire talk show host David Letterman to replace him in Nightline in the 11:35 p.m. time slot. The effort, though it failed, created a huge controversy. For the sake of honesty in advertising, I want to say up front that Ted is one of my best friends. I've known him for many years and I admire him enormously. If you think during this interview that some of my questions may sound uncharacteristically soft, then that is the reason. I promise I shall try to probe and to push in certain areas, and I suspect that Ted will probably have to bob and weave in certain areas. In any case, let's see what happens, and Ted, welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. You've just returned from the Middle East, where you did a series all week long of thoughtful, and let me quickly add, relevant broadcasts.
You better explain what that word's about.
We'll get to that. You were in Jerusalem, you were in Bethlehem, you were in Ramallah. And watching you running down that street one night, I think it was in Bethlehem, I had the impression that this was a very dangerous assignment. Was it more dangerous than others that you've been in, more than a war that you have covered?
No, I mean, it's dangerous only in its potential. What had happened was we literally just flown in on a Friday night from Washington, got into Jerusalem on Saturday afternoon, and wanted to get a head start on the following week. And the idea was to try and shoot a story over the weekend, Saturday night, Sunday, so that on Monday we would pretty much have something in the bank. And so I had asked to spend a night with an IDF unit, Israeli Defense Force unit. And they agreed. And they said, where do you want to go? And we said, wherever things are most active. And they said, you want to go to Bethlehem? We said, yes. It was about midnight or so, and while I was talking to some members of the Israeli negotiating team that had been meeting with the Palestinian negotiating team, and the Israelis, are all members of Israeli military intelligence. Very, very sharp group of young men. And as we were talking, there was a flurry in the hall outside. And we determined that there was someone inside the church who was ill, who wanted to come out. Not in and of itself a very threatening situation, but the Israelis, all of whom are paratroopers, the ones who were there, immediately deployed throughout the square. And they told us we could go with them, but they warned us that the Palestinians, as the Israelis do, have snipers all over the place. So we were all wearing flak jackets and trying to stay away from high points in the church, which might have been used as a sniper's nest. In that sense, the potential of danger, I don't think there was ever any real danger because the people inside wanted to be able to get that ill man out.
You were wearing a flak jacket?
Yes.
Were most of the reporters covering the story wearing flak jackets?
Most of the reporters who covered these stories, I mean, flak jackets are
now routine?
Routine. Indeed, a couple of days later, when we were driving from Jerusalem down to Ramallah, and this was late at night, the expectation was the Israelis were going to pull out of Yasser Arafat's compound. And we had made contact with some of Arafat's top advisors, and had been assured that I would get the first interview with him. That meant I had an interview with the Israeli Prime Minister at 6 in the evening. We didn't get through until about 7:45. And to drive down to Ramallah at night in times like these requires not only flak jackets for everyone who's going down, but we had an armored car. So yes, I mean, there is a potential there at all times.
Ted, there are a lot of stories about Israeli troops putting a great deal of pressure on foreign correspondents covering the story. And in one case, I remember in Bethlehem, taking press passes away for a day. At another occasion, threatening them in one way or another, I think in the Jenin area. But you seem to have full cooperation. I mean, maybe it's because you're so handsome or an anchorman or whatever.
That must be it.
But you did receive a great deal of cooperation.
We received an enormous amount of cooperation, but let me focus for a moment on what you correctly point out, is the atmosphere of friction that, as you know, frequently arises between the military, whosever military it may be, and the press. I think what you see reflected in the actions of the Israeli Defense Forces is no more or less than what you're seeing reflected at the Pentagon. And it is, in many respects, a hangover from the Vietnam War. I spent the better part of 3 years covering the war in Vietnam and in Laos and in Cambodia, but in Vietnam in particular, we never would have been able to do what we did in Vietnam without the cooperation of the U.S. military. At that time, we got to wherever we needed to go on U.S. Army helicopters or on Air Force fixed-wing aircraft, or driving with the military in APCs or Jeeps, or simply hiking with the military when they were going on foot. There was a tremendous amount of cooperation, and there was no censorship at that time. The military clearly, looking back, felt that it got badly burned in Vietnam. And as we saw 10, 11 years ago in Operation Desert Storm, the level of cooperation was infinitely less. As we see now in the operation in Afghanistan, the U.S. military has been more selective than I have ever seen them in terms of their willingness to allow the press to accompany them on operations. I think the Israelis have learned from that, and they're doing the same thing.
What have they learned?
I think they've learned that in this era of live television, where quite literally you can have a live uplink as a military engagement is going on, that first of all, and this has absolutely nothing to do with suspicions of what the media may be doing, whether the media is biased in one direction or biased in another direction. It is a purely technical thing. Everybody is watching. Everybody is watching CNN, everybody is watching Fox, I mean, over there, everybody's watching MSNBC. More to the point, everybody is watching Al Jazeera these days. And if you can, during an operation, if a commander 10 miles away, or 500 miles away for that matter, can be watching something live as it unfolds, that's better than having half a dozen spies in the area. If you've got live television cameras on the scene, those television cameras can work for or against either side.
And which may be one of the reasons why the American people, so many of the American people, seem very upset, agitated by the nature of the coverage today, and they've raised any number of serious questions. And I would like to ask you, since so many questions have been raised about the fairness, the accuracy of the reporting, whether you, on the basis of what you saw in this recent visit, can sympathize with this upswelling of opinion, or do you feel it's misplaced?
Well, first of all, as you know better than most, media is a plural noun, and it's more plural than it's ever been. There are more media out there than there have ever been. That is both good news and bad news. It means, I think, that there is more good information getting out there. It also means that there is more crap getting out there. And if we are all going to be judged on the basis of the worst that is transmitted by the least capable among us, then yes, I can understand why it is that people are as upset with the media, generally speaking, as they are. But I think in fairness, you have to be a little more discriminating about it. I think there's also a lot of very good reporting that is being done. And what I always find a little bit amusing is that when people cite instances of things that they are concerned about, my question to them always is, where'd you learn about that? Where'd you hear about it? Where'd you read about it? Where'd you see it? And inevitably, they either saw it on television or heard it on the radio or read it in the newspapers. It is in the nature of every business that there are good, bad, terrible, sometimes very good practitioners of what is being done.
Ted, I certainly agree with that. But at the same time, there appears to be an extra dimension of concern about the nature of the coverage today. There is much more anguish in terms of the effect of the coverage on people and on policy. And so it isn't, your explanation could almost apply as a nice warm blanket over just about any situation. But this one seems different because it's generated that much more heat.
I think it's different only in the sense that one of the things that the United States and Israel have in common is that they are both functioning democracies, yes, and very good ones. And there is, I believe, a tendency among the media to hold both the United States and Israel to a higher standard than some terrorist cell, for example. What I'm saying really is that if people who are committed to carrying out murders of civilians, in fact, carry out the murder of civilians, there's no great surprise about that. If a U.S. military unit commits some sort of atrocity, or if an Israeli military unit commits some sort of atrocity, the public reaction to it and the media reaction to it and the way that it is covered is, I think, far more intense, precisely because the expectations of both the U.S. military and the Israeli military are higher to begin with.
Explain to me why it is that if one were to read the European press on a regular basis, you would find, more or less, I'm generalizing now, but you would find a pro-Palestinian tilt in the direction of the coverage, in the coverage. And that in the American press, I think overall, you would probably find a pro-Israeli tilt. And yet you and I...
Although that seems to undermine your previous question.
No, what I'm trying to get at is the general statement, impressions. Right. We live in a world that is almost composed of perception as much as reality. Right. You had a program this past week in which you talked about the images of war and the war of images. I mean, there's a battle going on this. And I'm conveying an impression. You and I both remember this sense of objectivity in the media, that if you and I went into this room to cover this story, we would more or less come out with the same story. Yours might be better written, you may have a better interview with somebody, but essentially the same story. How could reporters claiming to come from democratic societies come up with essentially different stories?
I think it simply reflects the politics of the two regions you're talking about. In France, for example, where there have been significant outbreaks of anti-Semitism over the last 6 months or a year, you have a community of, and don't hold me to the precise number, but I think you have 5 or 6 million Arabs living in France these days. It's a far greater number than the number of Jews living in France. Here in this country, the difference actually might surprise people. It's not, there aren't that many more Jews than Arabs living in this country or Muslims living in this country, but the number is 1 million or so more. But there is no question but that American Jews, having been here much longer in numbers, have learned, as people in a democracy do, to exercise the levers of influence and power more effectively than their Arab American colleagues. And I think there is no question but that that ultimately has an impact, not necessarily directly on the media, but indirectly. If you're covering Washington, D.C., you cannot help but notice that Congress is disproportionately weighted, numerically I'm saying now, disproportionately weighted in favor of Israel and likely to be more critical of the Palestinian or the Arab side. If the media now is covering Congress or covering the White House, I think it's going to be inevitable that that slant in that direction is going to be reflected, just as it is on the other side in Europe.
What you're saying, in effect, is more at the base, it's much more politics than it is the functioning of the media in the contemporary age.
I think it's the combination of the two. I think it's the media reflecting the politics of the location.
You don't see anything particularly special about this crisis producing this level of anguish on the part of many Americans in terms of the coverage?
Well, I mean, as you mentioned in your introduction, Marvin, you and I have been friends for a very long time, and we first came to know each other in 1971, and we began to cover this story together, traveling with then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger in the Middle East. You remember, as I do, that when we went into Cairo, it was the first time there were no diplomatic relations between Egypt and the United States at that time. When we flew into Damascus,
There were diplomatic relations between Egypt and the U.S.
there was no exchange of ambassadors, I don't think, when we first went in. But
Anyway,
when we went into Damascus,
Not important.
when we went into Syria, the Secretary of State's Secret Service detail took its own water and food with it because they were concerned that they might be drugged or poisoned by the Syrians. There was a wonderful line, you remember our old late friend Walter Bothy, who was the head of the Secret Service detail, Kissinger's Secret Service detail at the time, and Kissinger was joking with them as they rode in from Damascus airport to Damascus for the first time, and it was kind of tense. And there were Syrian security people lined up the entire length of the route from the airport into town. And the U.S. Secret Service had insisted that they all be facing away from the motorcade and that their rifles be at their feet. There was that much concern that someone in the Syrian security detail might take a shot at Kissinger. And at one point, Kissinger, to lighten the mood, said to Walter Bothy, "What are you going to do if they kidnap me or if they try to kidnap me?" And Bothy said, "Make sure they don't take you alive, Mr. Secretary."
This kind of a trip to the Middle East must take a chunk out of the Nightline budget.
Actually, I was heading in another direction. If you don't mind,
You want to go back?
I just want to go back to that because the point of all of that was that 30 years ago, relations between the United States and the Arab world were, to all intents and purposes, very poor. I mean, we did have fairly decent relations with Jordan and fairly decent relations with Saudi Arabia, but, you know, and certainly not so with Egypt, certainly not so with Syria. And I think we have sort of grown accustomed. There has been a humanizing that has taken place over the past 30 years in the American mind of the Arab world. We don't look at it quite as suspiciously as we did 30 years ago. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is more tension today between those two positions than there might have been 30 years ago.
Good point. Well, let me jump ahead now to the next area. The cost of taking your show on the road to the Middle East, considerable?
Yes.
How much it cost?
I don't know precisely what it cost, but I think I can say that the average broadcast over there, simply because of the cost of when an anchorman travels he takes a fairly, or she takes a fairly significant technological tail, is required just to get a broadcast on the air. And I think the average cost of a program would be about triple what it normally is.
Which is roughly what?
I'd say the average cost is probably about $25,000 a broadcast, and doing it from overseas like this might cost anywhere from $50,000 to $75,000.
And given the nature of budgetary concerns these days at the network, is this something that you have to, or the executive producer has to routinely check with the president of ABC?
We would not go overseas on a major trip like this without the approval of the president. That's right.
And this is something that you would have to have done, say, 5 years ago as well as now?
Yes.
And when you did a program or a series of programs like this one 5 years ago, were you able to do more of those in the course of a year?
No question.
Than now?
No question. And I can illustrate it more graphically perhaps by telling you that 20 years ago, just after we began the broadcast, it was not at all unusual that if a correspondent was going off on a story, he didn't even bother to check the commercial airline schedule. He'd just charter a Lear.
Right.
Literally,
Right.
You'd charter a plane, you'd charter a jet, and you'd go off and you'd fly there, and then you'd have the plane waiting, and you'd fly back with it. Those kinds of things only happen now in the most extreme cases.
Ted, tell me, let's get into the Letterman business.
Sure.
I read that both you and the president of ABC News, David Weston, knew nothing about the negotiation until that pivotal Thursday when the information began to leak.
That's correct.
That's correct.
It didn't just start to leak, it was in the New York Times.
For the following day.
Right, yes.
And Robert Iger, who's the president of Disney, says that he tried reaching you twice on that Thursday,
Right.
and twice again on Friday. And either you didn't get the calls, he says, or you didn't choose to return them. Straighten us out as to what happened.
The first call, he did call Thursday evening, and my wife Grace Ann and I were out at dinner. When I came back, there was a call waiting for me from David Weston. David told me what had happened. He said, "I know Bob's going to call you." And I said, "I really don't think that I ought to take the call tonight because I need to be able to internalize this." It came as a significant shock. And the following day, in point of fact, Bob did call, and I did take the call, and we did talk.
You did talk to him the following day?
Yes.
So this idea about 4 calls being unanswered.
No, it was one call that was unanswered. One call I was out. The second call I just said, "Please, let's not even do it." And the second call did not come because I'm sure that David called Bob and said, "Let it wait until tomorrow."
I see. As you think back upon this all now,
Right.
what does it say to you about the relationship that you, as a very principal force at ABC News, had or has with the management of ABC News and the people who own ABC, Disney?
I must tell you, as I indicated both in an op-ed piece that I wrote for the New York Times and then in a statement that my management colleagues at Nightline and I released a few days later, I have no fundamental problem with the notion that I do not work for a charitable institution. I've always understood that. I know that the Disney Corporation is in business to make money. I also know that it is their belief, indeed their conviction, that if they had been able to get David Letterman to join ABC, it would have made a great deal of money for the corporation. And while I wish that things weren't quite that crass, perhaps, I know that they are. And I know that that has nothing to do with Disney. It would have been the same thing with Capital Cities, who owned us before then. It would have been the same thing with ABC Paramount, who owned us before that. What did disturb me was that in the company's eagerness to convince David Letterman that because he had expressed some concern, he didn't want to be the force responsible for getting rid of Nightline and me, which I appreciate very much. In the company's concern that they reassure him, some statements were issued through the voice of an anonymous executive or two. I still don't know who that executive is, which suggested A, that Nightline was no longer relevant. That was the
Relevancy of Nightline just is not there anymore. Quote,
anymore.
unquote.
Right. I wasn't willing to work as hard anymore as I used to, because under a contract that I signed a year and a half ago, I only do the program 3 nights a week. What that executive neglected to mention is that there are other aspects of the contract which in fact have me working so that I'm still doing it 4 times a week, but be that as it may. What were some of the other things? There were a number of negative things that was said. The essence of it being, look, we were going to dump this turkey anyway, so you, David Letterman, don't need to feel any responsibility for it. I thought that was kind of churlish. As you mentioned, I've been with ABC almost 40 years. I've been doing Nightline for 22 years. I just didn't think that was the classiest way of making this move.
Is there a classy way of making this kind of a move?
Yes.
How would you imagine it to be done?
I think, almost everything else they did, I think they tried to do in a classy way.
Buy you a dinner?
No. Look, when I say that I'm in a commercial industry, as I indicated in my op-ed piece in the Times, I understand the nature of the bargain that I made. I make a hell of a lot of money. I make more money in this business than I could make doing anything else, assuming that I had the kind of talent that would enable me to do anything else. And I've been working for them for 39 years now, and during those 39 years, I have led a wonderful life. I've enjoyed every moment of it, and my family and I have benefited from it enormously. And if they had come to me and said, Ted, the string has just run out, here's the deal, we're living in bad economic times, and here's a chance for us to make X million dollars a year more. And we'll do everything we can to keep you on, to find another place for you, or to allow you to leave with dignity. I would have been hurt, I would have been upset, but I would have understood. What I didn't like was the trashing of the broadcast. I just didn't think that was right.
You described these anonymous sources as attack weasels.
I did. Yes.
That didn't sound like the diplomatic correspondent I knew and loved.
Well, I really wasn't striving for diplomacy at that point.
I understand. Yes. Ted, David Weston was quoted as saying in that period that he let Nightline get away with everything for years. He let Nightline get away with everything for years. What is he talking about?
I don't know. You'll have to ask David Weston.
I know, it's a good State Department answer, but what do you think he was getting at?
It's the only one you're going to get.
What were you getting away with?
I don't believe...
Was he giving you too much money?
No,
you didn't have to check with him?
I don't think so. I think, the fact of the matter is that when you arrive at a certain age in life...
you don't look at that.
Oh, thank you. I guess you just, you have and receive a little more independence perhaps than you had, when you were 25 or 30. And David, for the most part, has been very generous, I think, in giving Nightline and the management team a good deal of independence.
But is he saying now that he, in fact, made a mistake in giving you too much?
Well, I think
that is now going to change, which gets to my question about having to check with him before going to the Middle East.
I think you're quoting liberally from David Margolik's piece in Vanity Fair. I understand.
I want to get away with that.
Yes, I mean, sometimes quotes get misquoted. I have no idea.
Koppel, you were a State Department correspondent. I mean, that's what they always say.
Of course they do.
Every State Department official, every broadcast you did, you didn't get it quite right.
That's right, and they do that for good reason, because they don't want to dump on their bosses.
Oh, is that it?
Yes.
During that time, there were some cutting, unflattering descriptions, as you alluded to a moment ago, about you and Nightline, and a couple of them that I spotted in preparing for this broadcast were the principality of Nightline, like hoo-ha, it's off there by itself. His Tedness, which I thought was rather
It's nice.
interesting.
Yeah.
This elite enclave in Washington. That would suggest to me, if there is any relevance and reliability to these quotes, that you all were off in your own world, and the people in New York might have resented that. But maybe they didn't, and it was only after the Letterman thing got started that people began to talk in these terms.
Look, again, we've established both of our seniority, and you and I remember and know that a certain amount of tension between the New York-Washington axis always exists, always has. It existed at the CBS Bureau, it exists at
Absolutely.
the ABC Bureau, NBC, the New York Times. There is always a sense in Washington that those idiots in New York don't understand us,
Right.
and always a sense in New York that those renegades down in Washington are trying to run their own show. There's absolutely nothing unique about that, nothing new about that. I don't take those quotes terribly seriously,
Okay.
and I don't think you should either.
Okay. It was also said that Nightline was spared Disney's budgetary cuts. Is that accurate?
No. The reason it's not accurate is that my good friend Tom Battag, who is our executive producer, has invested an enormous amount of effort over the last few years to reprocess some of our product, so that, for example, at one point we took a 5-part series that we had done on U.S. prisons and consolidated that into a primetime special that went on the air during the summer, some months after the original series ran. When we did a series about 15 months ago on the Clinton years, we did that in collaboration with PBS's Frontline. They contributed money to our production of that broadcast. They were able to put on 2 hours that ran in a row. We put on 5 half hours that ran over a period of a week. Because of that, I mean, we had gone to our bosses at Disney and said, look, it seems to me there are 2 ways of dealing with hard financial times. You can either cut the budget or you can increase the income. We'd like to try increasing the income. And that's what we did. So when people only look at the side of saying Nightline didn't have the same budget cuts, the reason for that is because Nightline had gone out and in a number of ways, and I've only cited a couple of them, earned more money so that we could keep staff on.
Ted, during the bad days and weeks of this Letterman flap,
The recent unpleasantness,
the
as we
recent
refer to it,
unpleasantness,
yes.
it will come as no surprise to you that a number of your friends and admirers thought that what you really should have done was quit.
Right.
Did you ever consider that?
Let me put it this way. We have 40-some-odd people who work for Nightline. When Tom Battag and I signed a new 5-year contract, which we did about a year and a half ago, the rest of the staff took that as a cue that he and I were going to be around for 5 years, and they signed 5-year contracts. While Tom and I both have what are called windows in our industry, in our contracts, they did not. If we had left, they would have had to stay. If we had left, our fear was that, Nightline, some of the people might have used that then as an opportunity to get rid of Nightline, even if David Letterman didn't come over. So I must tell you quite seriously, our concern was at all times that we do whatever we could to reinvigorate the program, to make sure that the corporation's commitment to the program was as unambiguous as it could possibly be. And that's what, in fact, has happened. So that was what we wanted from the first, and that is what we now have.
So the idea of quitting was never seriously considered because of your concern about the 40-odd people working for you.
And because of our concern about trying to keep the broadcast
Keep the
going.
broadcast going.
Right.
And you did work out, you got some kind of commitment from Disney
Right.
ultimately,
Yes.
right? And what I read in the paper is that it's a 2-year commitment. Is that right?
It's right that you read it in the paper.
But it's wrong that it's a 2-year commitment?
You're a very good State Department correspondent, but I sat at those briefings with you for so many
You're
years.
not going to answer that.
I'm not going to answer it because the understanding that we had, that is the Disney people and I, is that the terms of the agreement, and there are more terms to it,
Right.
would remain between us, would remain
So
secret.
you have an understanding as opposed to a written commitment?
I didn't say that either.
No, I am saying that.
I understand what you're
You
saying.
use the word understanding.
You're free to say whatever you want, and I'm
No, but
free
you
to.
did use the word understanding.
I said we had an understanding that whatever the commitment
Right.
was would remain secret.
And what I am asking you is, do you have a written agreement with these people who a couple of months ago tried to move you out of your job and your program as well?
And my answer to you is, I heard your question. I even understood your question the first time, and clearly I'm not answering your question. However, if you want to
Because
try,
in 6 months,
if you want to try again,
in 6 months, for example,
yes.
what is to stop Disney from saying, enough of this stuff? At 11:35, we're going to run Monkeys. It's their network. I mean, they
Their
can do
network.
that, right? They can do it. There's nothing that, even if everybody writes and understands that you've got a 2-year understanding,
Yeah.
they can violate that 2 years anytime they want.
Look,
I mean, is that not right?
before this all began, I had a 5-year contract.
Right.
Contract, written, pored over by teams of lawyers on both sides.
You mean as distinct from what you've got now with the...
No, I don't mean as distinct from. I mean as distinct from what I'm not going to talk about. The contract is something that I am going to talk about. And did that protect Nightline? We ironically...
But they could have dropped Nightline, paid you off
Yes.
each year. Let's say you're
They
getting
could have done
paid
that.
a couple of $100 a year, and
Right.
they would have